So the next speaker is Helmut Hauser, who is currently working at Rob Pfeiffer's lab in University of Zurich. And as soon as Helmut is ready, it's your turn.
Okay. So thank you, Angelo. Thank you also for allowing me to participate in these Shanghai lectures. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here. And I think it was really good that Vincent had this talk just right before my presentation, because they fit, I think, quite nicely together. And so we'll try to build a little bit on what have already been said here. So I'm going to talk today about the concept morphological computation, which is closely related to embodiment, but concentrates more on the computational part. And I'm going to show also how it supports the design approach, which has been taken or is being taken in the context of soft robotics. So in order to do that, I think it's important to at least explain a little bit what I mean by morphological computation, because I assume not everybody is familiar with the concept. There are no general definitions available which everybody would agree upon, but one way to describe it is this quite lengthy sentence. So I would like to concentrate you on a couple of terms here. It's important to see, like, morphological computation, like embodiment, is a concept. It's an abstraction of an idea based on some observations that we're able to make in biological systems, and by that I mean animals and plants as well. And what we can see is that the form and the shape, the morphology in general of such systems seem to do computation in a very abstract way. And to be a little bit more concrete, let's assume you have a human body. The original idea was, a long time ago, that the central brain is the central control of the whole body, and everything is controlled from the brain. But as we know now, that's not really the case. And in the context of morphological computation, one can make the interpretation that even on the physical level, computation is done. So you could take a part of the computation and outsource it to the morphology. So this also means that what's left over for the brain, so to say, is now much smaller. It's less complex. Now, what about soft robotics? It's a new emerging field. People have been working in that, but it seems to be that just recently a lot of people are joining the community. And in general, soft robotics is about robots which have been built, at least to a certain extent, out of soft material. Just a couple of examples. Here's the octopus arm, which has been developed in the European project Octopus, the Harvard starfish you can see, or the very soft caterpillar robot by Barry Trimmer's lab in Tufts University. Closely related, of course, there are also the implementation of soft actuators, for example, Denon-driven systems, which you can see in the Edge robot. You might be familiar with that. And in general, one can say that soft robotics is something which is bio-inspired, or a lot of time biomimetic approaches are taken in order to build such robots. And they do that because such robots are inherently safe. You can interact with them without having the danger that they kill you or break your arm, for example. Potentially, they're also more energy efficient, and they're highly resilient. You can run a car over the starfish, for example, and it doesn't break. Now, what is the big disadvantage of such a soft robotic structure? Well, they're really hard to control. It's a very complex system. Now, having said that, what is the connection now between morphological computation and soft robotics? Well, what we did, we looked into theoretical models to describe the computational power of physical bodies. So we came up with two models, and then we asked a very important question. We wanted to know what are the desired properties in order to have a computationally powerful body. And the answer is quite remarkable. First, such a body has to be high dimensional in its state space. Second, it has to exhibit nonlinearity. You have to have compliance. And fourth, you also should have noise in the context of morphological computation. Now, looking at this wish list, they clearly point into the direction of soft robotics and soft animals. Now, how can we use that in the design approach? So this is exactly what Vincent was talking about. The second point in this last slide, that we want to, for example, design better robots using the concept of embodiment. In order to do that, I think it's a good idea to make one step back and take a look at the classical robot design, just to make a comparison. And I would like to take the Asimov robot, which is a very ingenious piece of engineering, but it's built based on a classical robot design. So what are the ingredients? Well, first of all, you use rigid body parts. You use high torque servo motors. And in the design, you try to keep the number of degrees of freedom as low as possible. From the control viewpoint, you try to control the system at every single time step. Like every milliseconds, you want to tell every single degree of freedom what it has to do. So why do you want to do that? Well, looking at this list, of course, this is an engineering-based approach. And it makes sense because it facilitates control. That's why you do it, basically. Now, looking at nature, at biological systems, you can see there's a completely different, let's call it, design approach. We have soft body parts in a human body, for example. We use a soft actuator system. We are driven by compliant tendon system, muscle tendon systems. We use a large number of degrees of freedom. And we have a lot of underactivation going on, a lot of degrees of freedom which are not explicitly controlled. So looking at this one from the viewpoint as a control theorist, and that's also my background, this is a complete nightmare. And since today is Halloween, this is something you don't want to have. It makes you shiver just looking at it. But the good news is, if you look at the same problem, but from a different viewpoint, from the viewpoint of morphological computation, you look at it, suddenly this list of properties are beneficial. And interestingly, they help you to facilitate control. So now that sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but I hope at the end of my presentation you're going to agree with my point of view here. Now, having said that, let's take a closer look what we define as morphology and what kind of computation might be of interest in the context of morphological computation. So morphology, clearly, it's first of all the form, the shape of the robot, of the biological system, but that's not all. We also include all dynamical parameters which define the dynamical behavior of such a body, like spring constants, damping, friction, and so on. A third point is also very important, the locations of the sensors and the actuators, the way that we perceive our environment and the way that we act on it. And the fourth point, which is also very important, and a lot of people don't think about it, the environment itself is part of the morphology. For example, a passive walker is just able to walk downstairs, or not downstairs, but down slope, because otherwise it doesn't have the gravity and it wouldn't work at all. So what about computation? Well, if you talk about theoretical models and computation, the first thing which pops into your mind, of course, is a Turing machine. It's a very well-defined and very wonderful concept with a lot of cool applications. However, it's not very biological. And a Turing machine basically takes an input, uses some finite amount of time, and produces an output. An animal doesn't have the luxury to wait for the output to be produced. Actually, it has to do an ongoing computation. It's actually continuous ongoing computation with the feedback through the environment back into the sensory system. And so we thought, how can we capture that in a mathematical framework? And our solution was to do that with the help of operators. So what are operators? Just to remind you, operators are mathematical objects which are mapping input function or a set of input functions onto an output function. So it's not just a value mapping, because this would be a function on its own. So let's get a little bit more concrete, because it sounds a little bit abstract. What kind of functions are of interest? Well, functions in time. For a robot, it could be, for example, the sensory input streams. This is a continuous function in time, and this should be mapped onto a motor output, which makes sense for the robot to fulfill a certain task. So we are going to encode our computation in a very concrete way in mathematical operators. So this is a very pragmatic approach. And we want to do that with the help of morphology. So at the end, we have something which is a continuous analog computation, which is different from the classical Turing machine definition. Now, having said that, I can start now with the first theoretical models. And this is based on a theoretical result by Boyd and Chua from the mid-'80s. And they were talking about a certain subclass of operators which have the property to be time invariant and have a fading memory. So it's important to see here, again, we encode our computations that we're going to describe with our morphological computation setup with exactly this kind of operators. And it's important to see, although they are restricted, we still have nonlinear dynamic operators. And by dynamic, I mean to compute the output, you have to include the history of the values in exponential decay. So it means basically the values farther in the past are not that important than the one closer to the time now. So we've basically two important things to do. First, we have to implement in our operator some nonlinearity in a general case and also some kind of memory. In the context of dynamical systems, one can say any exponential stable nonlinear dynamic system with one point of equilibrium could be presented by this definition used by Boyd and Joa and what we use here. So we can also have, for example, a computation which represents a nonlinear controller. Of course, this is very interesting for a robotic structure. So what is actually the result of Boyd and Joa? Well, they showed that these two basic steps, memory and nonlinearity, which are usually intertwined, you can separate them spatially. You can say, well, I do first the memory job, and in a second stage, separate from the first one, I can do all what is needed to do for nonlinearity. So this is quite remarkable, and you can come up with a structure with two stages. The first has to be dynamic, because it has to have this notion of memory, but can be linear. And the second stage has to be nonlinear, but can be static. The underlying structure is a little bit more complicated, but not too much. The first stage basically consists out of a couple of what they call filter. It's a very general concept, but these are these white boxes here, basically. It's important for you to understand what this first stage has to do. What is the job? Well, there are two jobs. First, it has to integrate information over time, which means I should know what has happened before. I should have some memory about the history of the input values. I guess that's quite clear. You can do it with an integrator, right? The second one is a little bit more abstract. It has to separate signals. And I would like to explain it here with a couple of graphs. Assuming that you have two different inputs. They're different, right? They should produce different outputs because different inputs, different outputs. Now it can happen at one point in time that they have exactly the same value, which you can see here on this example graph. Now the second stage doesn't have any notion of memory, so it would produce the exact same output, but that is wrong. So you have to make sure that you can find basically two filters which are able to distort basically these two signals in such a way that they are separable by the second stage. And this could be very easily done, for example, by a delay line, by some, well, linear system with some exponential decay. So it's not too easy to establish that. So what about the second stage? Well, this one has to take this information which has been integrated over time and combine it nonlinearly in order to produce the correct output. Now, it's important to understand here what we want to do is we want to have a computation which is defined as a nonlinear dynamic operator, and we want the second picture here, this two-stage process, to do exactly the same. Which means if I apply the same input to both things or both structures, they should produce the same output. So we're talking about emulation here. And we want to do that with the help of morphology. And we can do that, and we show that and prove that the first stage can be implemented with a set of linear mass spring systems, and the second stage can be implemented by an artificial neural network. Now, it's important to see what we've done here, actually. Well, the first stage is basically outsourcing some part of the computation into the morphology, into the physical layer. So this means, actually, temporal integration, it's a very specific part of the computation, can be outsourced to the morphology. This also means that the second stage is now simpler. In order now to learn to emulate this blue box, this operator, this computation, we simply can reduce the task to find some static output weights. So we can learn dynamic operators by finding some static output weights. And this only because of the help of the morphology. Now, having said that, I have to make here a couple of remarks. First of all, the structure is theoretically, right? It just tells us that it's theoretically possible to emulate any of these operators with arbitrary precision, which is quite nice. But if we have a given computation, theory doesn't tell us what kind of parameters we have to use, what kind of mass spring systems, nor how many. So it could be thousands of mass spring systems are necessary to get a certain minimum error. But, of course, this wouldn't be very practical. So this leaves us with two options. One, you make some nonlinear optimizations, like genetic algorithms, simulated annealing, any tool of choice, in order to adapt basically your parameters of this morphology to get the best performance. Or there's a second possibility to use generic networks. So you randomly initialize the structures and hope it works. So this is the lazy version, basically. And I have to admit, I went for the lazy one, and it works. So I'm happy with that, at least. So we came up with some generic random morphologies. So we choose, basically, from a range of parameters, randomly some values and assign them to the individual linear mass spring systems. For example, for the spring constants, damping constants, masses. And the ranges are not small. They're like, for masses, we use between 0.1 and 50. So it's quite a big range to choose from. Now, it's important that you can see the morphological structure has not been constructed for a specific task. So this implies we have the possibility to have multitasking. What does that mean? Well, we can use the same morphological structure and just put on it two different or more readouts and emulate different computations at the same time using the same morphology. Now, that's maybe interesting in simulation, but it's more interesting if you applied it to a real robot, because what you're doing is you exploit the body. In an animal, the morphology is not built to be a computational device, but rather in order to do something, right? You want to walk, you want to locomote, you want to grasp. So you have a given morphology, and just on top of that, you can exploit this underlying complex dynamics by using this kind of setup. Now, what are the desired properties in order to have a computationally powerful structure? What kind of morphology we need here? Well, again, the job is it should integrate information and separate signals. For the integration, of course, we need compliance. Any rigid body is not able to integrate anything here. We need a big number of mass spring systems. The more systems we have, the more signals we're able to separate. And for the same reason, we need a variety of different mass spring systems. And everything, of course, points into the direction of soft animals and soft robots. Now, the question is, of course, it's nice to outsource the temporal integration, but can we do more with the morphology? Can we basically have the separation moved a little bit more to the right? Yes, we can do that by the following line of argumentation. If you look at the artificial neural network, what it's doing basically, it's a nonlinear static mapping. And this could be done also what's called in machine learning a kernel. What is a kernel? It maps a low-dimensional input in a nonlinear fashion into a high-dimensional state space. And one could see a complex body as some physical implementation of such a finite kernel. And one way to describe it in a rather abstract way, or a generic way, is to have, well, a recurrent network of nonlinear springs and masses. So we end up with a structure which looks like this. So now we outsourced integration and nonlinear combination to the morphology. It's important to note here, we don't have any theoretical proof for that anymore. But the line of argumentation is a valid one, as we've showed and demonstrated in simulation and in robotic platforms as well. I'm going to show that a little bit later. So to remind you, what we want to do is we want to emulate a nonlinear dynamic operator. And we do that by outsourcing temporal integration and nonlinear combination into the morphology, which means the rest, what has to be done in order to make the whole computation, is basically have a linear static readout from the state of the system to produce the output. So we can use linear regression to learn a nonlinear dynamic operator, just because we have the help of the morphology. Now, looking again at the properties, what kind of properties are needed for this morphology? Well, again, it's randomly initialized. We just exploit the dynamics there. But it would be nice to have a lot of a high-dimensional state space here, right? We want to have this projection into a high-dimensional state space, kernel property. Again, it should be nonlinear, since the projection should be nonlinear. And of course, we're still doing this integration, so we need compliance in our system. Looking again at this list, and at the classic robot design, you are not able to find these properties there. Actually, they are suppressed. You don't want these properties. You do everything to get rid of that. On the other hand, looking at soft animals, soft robots, you have to deal exactly with this kind of properties. Now, what are the limitations of this setup? Well, it depends on the definition that we made. What kind of operators are able to be emulated by this setup? Well, time invariance is not a big issue here, but the constraint here is coming from the fading memory, because it loses the information over time. So if you want to have some kind of persistent memory, like a finite state switching machine, analog implementation, for example, you're not able to do that. But more interesting for me, as I'm interested in locomotion, limit cycles are not able to be implemented. So there was a need for another theory. And we came up with another one as well, of course. And it's based on feedback linearization from control theory. So we need a different starting point. But at the end, the structure is quite similar to the first one. And this is the output. Again, we have an input and output. And now, in addition, we have this feedback from the output back into the system. And only just adding this feedback boosts the computational power of the setup immensely. And the way that we describe in this theory the computation is not just abstract as an operator, but we can define it as a differential set of equations in a very generic form. Z is here the state variable, and G is a nonlinear function which can be arbitrary. It just has to be smooth enough. So this is a very powerful description of our computation. And it includes everything from the first theory, but includes even more like limit cycles. Again, we want to do an emulation. We want to learn to have the same behavior with the upper structure. And we can do that just by adapting some linear output weights, because with the help of the morphology. Okay, now I would like to talk a little bit about the learning setup, because I think that's important for you to understand why noise is coming in here. Well, remember, we want to do an emulation, and basically, in practical sense, this means we have data sets. One is the input and one is the output. So this is the definition of our behavior. And we want to do the same with our structure. So we have here a supervised learning setup. And of course, you're not able to do that in a closed loop because it renders unstable usually. So you have to open the loop and you feed the system in a feedback, assuming that it produces the perfect output, which is the target output, right? And then you feed also at the same time the input. And what you do is you collect all the data over time. But if you then would use that for linear regression, for example, to learn a limit cycle, this wouldn't be enough, because if you close the loop, even numerical imprecision is sufficient to leave you away from this normal trajectory. You get unstable. So what you have to do is you have to add noise here. So basically this means you don't learn just this trajectory, but also some region of attraction around it in order to get it into a robust limit cycle. So having done that, you basically calculate then with linear regression the optimal weights to produce the target output, and then you close the loop and hope that it works. So now I would like to show you a simulation result and a result on a robotic platform where we applied exactly this approach. So the first one is in simulation. It's called the input-dependent limit cycle. So you can see here two differential equations. So it's with the state variables x1 and x2, and it defines a limit cycle. And there's a small red epsilon, which we define as being the input to the system. And depending on this input, we get different limit cycles, different frequencies, different amplitudes, different shapes. So it looks like this. We used three different values for the input, 0.2, 1, and 5. And you can see you have a different shape in the phase portray, which is x1 versus x2. Looking at the time series, you can see for the value epsilon equals to 0.2, you get this shape. And if I change it now to a different input 1, you get another shape with a different frequency, and yet another shape if I change the input to 5. Now the idea is to have a setup which looks like this. I have a randomly initialized morphology, which is this complex structure here. I apply in constant input either one of these three values. And depending on this input value, the system should produce the corresponding limit cycle. So we have two readouts. One should produce state variable x1, the other one x2, and this information is then fed back into the system. So it's important to see here how we apply the input as well the feedback. Well, in the initialization phase, we randomly choose input nodes, approximately 20%, for example, and they receive the input as a force, so a constant force at some random mass nodes. The same with the feedback, randomly chosen feedback nodes, and you have a time-varying feedback, which is basically a time-varying force applied to these randomly chosen nodes. Now, it's important to see that we want to use just one set of output weights to produce all three limit cycles. Just a different input should make the change in a system in such a way that it produces a different limit cycle. So these are the results here. You can see for the value, input value of epsilon equals 5, the time series it's quite constant, it's robust, it stays on its trajectory. And you can see the corresponding limit cycle in the phase per tree on the right side. Now, then what we did is we suddenly switched from 5 to 1. So there's some phase of transition, but after a while it settles down, eventually to its corresponding limit cycle, as you can see on the right plot. So the color coding is, if it's bluish, it's at the beginning, right after this transition, and if it gets red and brown, it's at the end when it found its way back to this new limit cycle. Then we made another switch from 1 to 0.2, again, some time of transition, and it found its way to its corresponding limit cycle. It's important to see here, we haven't shown the system how to make this transition. We simply showed the individual limit cycles and we added some noise. But this attraction was sufficient in order to attract it if it was close enough to get to the right limit cycle and stay there in a robust fashion. Now, I think it's important here to discuss something because this could look like a DOE example, but I think there's some real applications in there. Again, we have the setup. For the sake of simplicity, I just have here just one output, but again, there are two outputs and two feedback loops. And as you remember, we had here a constant set of output weights, right? We don't change it after we've learned it. And then what we do is basically we have this randomly chosen input nodes and we apply constant force. It's like squeezing the soft body with a certain amount of force, with a certain amplitude, and it produces a corresponding limit cycle. Now, if we squeeze it a little bit more, we get a different limit cycle. And now, if we increase the squeezing even more, we get yet another limit cycle. I think this is quite interesting because it seems to be the system is able to sense somehow through its morphology what it has to do. One way or one application could be, for example, to have a quadruped or any kind of locomoting robot. And what you could imagine if we have a backpack, right? It's a really heavy weight. We change our postures and we walk like this and maybe even make smaller steps. So we change the limit cycles for our actuators in order to have a more energy efficient or a more stable walking gait. So one could assume by keeping this readout, which could be the controller, right? Keeping it constant, just putting a heavy weight on the robot, it would be able to sense it through its body and produce a corresponding now better limit cycle for its actuators. Now, finally, I would like to show also an application in a real robotic platform. And this work has been mostly done by Koen Nakashima and Dao Li from our lab in Zurich as well. And what they did it in the context of this EU project Octopus. They had this soft silicon structure which resembles an octopus arm. So it's completely passive. And they put it or submerged it into a water tank. So it was its natural environment, so to say. And they implemented then bending sensors along the surface of this structure. So it allows us to measure the bending at the different locations. And they attach it to a motor with 1 degree of freedom, which basically moves through back and forward. And what you want to do is basically implement the same approach. So we have this morphology, which has been randomly initialized in our simulations. But here, we just have to use what's given, right? We have this structure because we want to have an octopus arm. It has the same softness or very similar softness. That's why we use silicone. So we just take what's given, what kind of morphology, and exploit it on top of that. And we want to read out the state of the system in a linear fashion. And we did that by linearly combining sensory information of the system in order to produce the motor output, which should be a squared function, a back and forth movement of this robotic arm. So we have this feedback loop. It moves this arm, bending sensors have different values, it produces a different motor signal. So we are exploiting the body here. It's very important to see. Another important point is the nonlinearity and memory which is needed for such a task is in the body. Remember, the readout is static and linear. So everything what's nonlinear and memory, it's in the body. And the noise which we have added artificially in the simulation is coming from the sensory noise. And maybe it's a... Yeah,
Helmut,
I've just...
time for one extra slide, yes.
Okay, it's one video and one slide at the end. Thank you. So basically, it's not just only the morphology of the octopus arm, but also the nonlinearity in the sensor or in the motor of contributing to this morphology as well. So maybe, Nathan, you can show now the video, please, of the octopus arm. So what you see here is now the closed loop. And you can see it moves back and forth in a stable fashion. So basically, it reads out the sensor information constantly and produces a motor signal, which let it move back and forth. And now there's some perturbation coming from Tao Li. And you can see it's a robust limit cycle. It even stops and starts up again and finds its way back in a very robust fashion. Okay, thank you, Nathan. So this, let me conclude now with the final slide here, the take-home messages. So there are three of them. First of all, I think it's important, and you've seen that outsourcing computation to the physical body can facilitate the computation and the control task. A second important point is that high dimensionality, nonlinearity, compliance, and noise are your friends if you look at it from a different point of view, from the viewpoint of morphological computation. And third, computational exploitation is one possible way to control such a soft robot. And it's important to see here, we don't have to know the exact model of the body. We just exploit it. Linear regression does the magic here. So thank you very much for your attention. And these are my collaborators I would like to thank here as well.
Thank you, Helmut. And we have time for questions.
I have a question, if I may. Okay, thanks. I think that was great. Very interesting twist in the discussion. Do I understand this correctly, that what you're doing is you're taking a problem which has computational shape and then try to solve that with the morphology, as opposed to taking a problem which has behavioral shape, how do I get to move in the water, say, and then make a decision, I can solve this with morphology or with control, right? Which is, I mean, the passive dynamic walker seems to me is doing something of the second sort. It says, instead of doing control structure, I will do certain weight distribution, etc., on the legs so that I can do the walking. You're taking a problem which is already computationally shaped and then do the computation in the body.
Yes and no. Yes is, you're right, because we have a supervised learning setup, right? We define some computation that we want to do. So this is also a big drawback. You have to know that, right? But if you don't know what kind of limit cycle you have to do, you have to find some learning. And actually you can do that since it's linear regression. You can do all kind of online learning here. But the passive walker, in a context, what I'm talking about is, I guess, the best understood, it's like an extreme case. You outsource everything to the morphology. So basically, one could make the interpretation that this controlling of robustness is basically outsourced in form of some springs. It's quite easy to understand if you have a leg. We also have the same in our tendon system on the leg. If you push it, right, there's one spring which is prolongated, the other one is compressed, and you have basically a PD controller, which is a position controller if you have two springs attached to its side. So this is basically one way to see it. Is that a good answer for you, or do you?
Okay, so you think that what you're doing is a direct continuation of, let's say, cheap design approach.
Yes, that's one way to approach it, right? It's not fully understand. I think the interesting part about it is that we really see that we can say very specifically what we can outsource to a body. I mean, the list, what I say, what are important properties are very generic, right? It doesn't tell us anything how to design a robot. It just tells us, well, soft robots seem to be better for this approach than the classical robot design. But it doesn't tell you, okay, I want to have a locomotive robot, how do I have to build it?
Right, but you specify, as you say, you specify the computation. So if I have I don't know, say a grabbing problem, right? Mm-hmm. And I discover that it works better if I put soft material on the gripper, then I'm not specifying what the computation that's going on in there. In your approach, you would actually have the computation there and then say, here's how I carry it out in the morphology.
Yes. Yes.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, we have time for one other question.
Madrid. So a problem that's quite one of the hard problems in robotics seems to me is to try to make a system that can act correspondingly to different situations, and also kind of respond to the context that's in. So have you done any work on these, for example, the octopus robot interacting with loose objects, for example? So changing the spring mass system in a sense by interacting with the world, and whether that could facilitate recognizing what to do or recognizing certain tasks. Have you worked on those type of problems?
We did not, but there's some work which has been done by Benjamin Schrauben's group. They simulated complex density structures, where they did something like with this sensing through the body, which goes into that direction, but it's not like grasping, right? They learned to locomote on the ground, and then they applied different grounds, one with some knobs and one with a flat one, and they were able to identify through the state in the body on what ground they are locomoting. So it goes in that direction, what I showed with this example of the quadruped robot. But grasping, that's different, yes. But it could be done, I guess, potentially.
Okay, I think we can switch, but I believe it's in the same.
Do you need this?